All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to unpack an economic argument from the author Colin Jenkins. It's an argument that tries to explain a feeling that a lot of people seem to be having, the sense that things are, well, kind of breaking down. Our whole goal here is just to walk through the logic of this analysis, step by step, so you can see how it's put together.
So, where do we even begin? Well, it all starts with that question right there. That feeling of constantly being on edge, Like you're walking on a tightrope, and things just don't seem to work the way they're supposed to. The text we're looking at today kicks off by asking why so many of us feel this way.
And right off the bat, the author basically says, hey, you're not wrong for feeling this way. The argument we're about to explore doesn't just dismiss this anxiety. Instead, it treats it as a totally justified reaction to something real that's happening. Okay, so here's the big idea. The core argument is that this feeling of collapse isn't just a string of bad luck or a series of random events. According to this analysis, it's actually the logical, predictable outcome of an economic system that's finally reached the end of its line. So to really get this argument, we've got to pop the hood on the system, right? We need to look at the engine itself. The text zeroes in on one very specific economic law that it claims is the key to understanding everything that's happening right now.
And here it is. It's got a bit of a mouthful of a name. The law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Let's just call it the TRPF. Now, I know that sounds super academic and complicated, but stick with me because it's the absolute core of the author's point, and we're going to break it down. Basically, it just says that over the long haul, the profitability of the entire system has a built-in tendency to shrink. Let's see how that's supposed to work. All right, this slide is basically the engine of the whole argument, so let's take our time with it. Step 1 kicks off with the core idea of this theory. All new profit comes from one place: human labor. Sure, machines are important, but in this view, they just pass their own value along. It's the worker who creates new value. Okay, step 2 is something we see every day: competition. Businesses are always trying to get an edge, right? So they invest in new tech, new machines, automation, all to be more efficient and cut down on labor costs. Makes sense. But here's the twist. In step 3, across the whole economy, the pile of money spent on things, machines, technology, infrastructure, grows way faster than the pile of money spent on paying workers. And that leads us to the big paradox in step 4. If profit can only come from the human labor part of the investment, but that part keeps getting smaller and smaller compared to the total investment, well then the overall rate of profit gets squeezed. A company's total profits might still be going up, but its profit margin, what it gets back for every single dollar it invests, is on a downward trend.
And this isn't some brand new idea the author just came up with. The source text grounds this whole concept directly in the work of Karl Marx. This quote pretty much says it all. The falling rate of profit isn't some accident, it's a logical necessity baked right into the system's DNA.
Okay, so if this is a built-in feature of the system, not a bug, what happens when it starts to cause a real full-blown crisis? Well, that brings us to our next section. The text argues that in the 1970s, this theory slammed into reality and the system had to do some pretty dramatic things to respond.
So this timeline here, which is based on data the author cites, kind of maps it all out for us. It shows the post-war golden age is a high point, but then a long slide begins, hitting a crisis point in the 70s. You can see there was a bit of a recovery. They call it the neoliberal era, but then the decline just picked up again, leading to the crashes and sluggish growth we've been seeing for the last couple of decades.
So the big question is, how did the system pull off that temporary recovery? Well, according to the author, it wasn't about fixing the root cause. It was more like putting the system on life support. This included things like neoliberalism, which changed the rules of the economy, financialization, where making money from money became bigger than making actual stuff, globalization, to find cheaper labor, and of course, quantitative easing, which is basically pumping new money into the system to keep the big players from going under.
And this quote from the text really gets at the heart of it. It's like these fixes were a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they explain why the system kept going, why it persevered. But on the other hand, they might just be setting the stage for an even bigger fall later on.
And this is where the argument takes a really interesting and maybe unsettling turn. It claims that once the system runs out of room to expand overseas, it starts using those same tactics at home on its own population.
They call this the imperial boomerang, and this slide really lays out the parallels the author is drawing. On one side, you have these tactics used in foreign policy, things like messing with other countries' governments. And on the other, you see how, according to this argument, those same strategies are mirrored back home through things like mass surveillance, militarized policing, and selling off public infrastructure. The idea is that the tools of control developed for the empire eventually come home to roost. Okay, so you might be thinking, wait a minute, how do you connect an economic theory from the 1800s to something like militarized police today? It's a huge leap, right? Well, the author's point is that you can't really see the connection if you're using the usual tools. To see it, you need a totally different framework.
And this quote here kind of explains the why. It frames this way of thinking less as a belief system and more as, well, an analytical tool. It suggests this lens is for anyone who looks around and feels like something is just basically and gravely wrong and wants to seriously dig into why that might be.
To make this whole different framework idea a bit more concrete, let's look at an example the source uses to compare different ways of thinking about an issue like racism. On the one hand, you have what's described as the liberal view, which sees racism as a problem of bad personal attitudes, an irrational bug in an otherwise okay system. But the Marxist view, as it's presented here, looks at it differently. It analyzes racism as a functional part of the system, a tool used to divide people and keep wages low. Again, the point here isn't to have a debate about the issue itself, but just to show how different analytical frameworks can lead to wildly different explanations for the same problem.
So where does all this lead? Well, according to the author, it leads to a massive fork in the road. If the system really is in a terminal decline, and the old tricks to keep it going don't work anymore, then society is faced with a huge choice.
And the conclusion here is pretty stark. The argument is that the way things have been run for decades, it's just not viable anymore. In this view, the economic pressure is just too intense for the traditional liberal democratic order to handle. The system, the author argues, can't just be tweaked or reformed anymore.
So if the old path is gone, the text concludes we're left with just two directions to go. The first is described as fascism, a complete merger of corporate and state power, using authoritarian control to manage the crisis and protect wealth. And the second path presented is socialism, defined here as direct control over the economy, the factories, the offices, the resources, by the working class and communities themselves.
And that's where the analysis leaves us. It doesn't give us the answer. It just lays out the problem and presents this fork in the road. So the final question it really leaves us with is, how does a society actually choose its future? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.